Good day, Canada. Good evening, Asia. It's Thursday. It's 12 p.m. in Toronto, and it's time for our regular webinar on immigration and visas to Canada. My name is Alex Davidson, and our topic today is crossing the Canadian border upon arrival. We initially decided to dedicate this webinar to border crossing for two major reasons. First of all, many of you would sooner or later come here, and we believe that it will be great to know in advance how to act and what to expect when you land in Canada. And another reason is that we have a number of clients from Asia who are about to come in a very short period of time. So we invited them as well to listen to the webinar today too, so that they could actually prepare accordingly. So crossing border upon arrival. This seemingly simple procedure may actually involve various complications in certain cases, and we'll let you know how to avoid trouble when arriving to Canada for those who do not have Canadian permanent resident status or Canadian citizenship. So our webinar today is mostly for those who applied and received temporary resident visas. Any type of temporary resident visas, work permits, study permit, tourist, doesn't really matter. Now you can arrive to Canada by sea, of course by air or by land. Arriving on board of a sea vessel is not really common today because cruise ships visit Canadian ports, but cruises are not generally used for travel to Canada. Pretty obvious. Canada has land border only with one country, with the United States of America, our southern neighbor. As such, majority of temporary resident visa holders come to Canada by air. However, the procedure is generally the same for sea, air, and for land travelers. Air travelers have to formally cross the Canadian border at the airport in Canada. There is a peculiarity in this border crossing scenario. If you're traveling, say from Istanbul to Montreal with connection in Toronto, or say for example there is pretty common scenario when people are flying from Dhaka to Istanbul and from Istanbul to Toronto, you will have to cross the border in Toronto because this airport is a so-called port of entry of your itinerary, the first Canadian airport where your multi-segment flight first lands in Canada. So once again, your first landing place, your first landing airport in Canada would be your port of entry. This is where you would be crossing Canadian border. And not only you will cross the border at the port of entry, all of your luggage, including carry-on and checked luggage, will be formally crossing the Canadian border with you at that airport. So here's the first advice for today. If your Canadian-bound flight has a connection in Canada, be prepared to receive your checked luggage at the very first Canadian airport. You will have to take it with you through customs and then check it again for the connecting flight to your destination if you have one. Therefore, make sure your flight has enough layover time to allow for all border crossing procedures because they might be quite lengthy, as we will discuss further. You will not be able to run hurriedly from one gate to another if you have short connection. Instead, you'll have to wait for your luggage, complete all border crossing formalities, and board your next flight then. So be prepared. When crossing the border upon arrival to Canada, you will have to deal with the Canadian Border Services Agency, or CBSA. That's the government authority in charge of all border-related matters in Canada. Your first point of contact with Canadian authorities will be a CBSA officer who will conduct a so-called preliminary examination, the mandatory procedure of initial screening of everyone who comes to Canada, be it a visitor or visa-exempt individual, a citizen, a permanent resident of Canada. Doesn't really matter. So what is a primary examination? Primary examination is generally a short interview conducted by a CBSA officer to assess visitors' admissibility to Canada. A visitor is asked a number of simple questions for this purpose, and based on the answers, and by the way, the visitor's behavior while answering those questions too, an officer makes one of the decisions: to allow a visitor to come to Canada, or to prohibit from entering Canada, or to refer a visitor to a secondary examination for more thorough assessment. Questions asked by CBSA officers are well known to anyone who travels often. That's: what's your purpose of visit? How long are you going to stay in Canada? What is your final destination in Canada? How much money do you have to support yourself in Canada? Where where will you be staying in Canada? Do you have a hotel booking? Whom are you going to visit in Canada? Do you have a return ticket? Are you bringing anything to Canada for sale? Do you have any prohibited or potentially dangerous items with you? Some questions, they actually depend on the current situation in the outside world. For example, these days visitors are often asked if they have visited countries affected by Ebola before coming to Canada. As I have already said, a CBSA officer will not just listen to your answers, but will also monitor your behavior and your reaction to answers asked. If you're excessively nervous, if you make long pauses when answering simple questions, or behave oddly in any other way, an officer may conclude that you are not straightforward, which in turn may mean trouble for you. So here are a few tips about talking to an officer at the border. Be calm and be absolutely focused. Answer all of your questions honestly. Provide short, clear answers to questions asked without getting deep into the details. Don't exacerbate the situation. Don't make it even worse. If you're asked if you're bringing weapons to Canada or not, the answer should be no, if, provided that you don't, right? Don't plunge into the details. Don't tell anybody that your uncle actually manufactures weapons, but today, occasionally you forgot to take them with you. Never, never, never try to argue with a CBSA officer. That's probably the worst idea you might ever have. Remember, he or she, the officer, has power to turn you back and get you out of Canada at the very same moment. I don't want to say it happens very often, but it does happen. And in 90% of cases, people were behaving oddly and they turned to be arguing with the officers. At any circumstance, avoid doing that. An officer may not only ask questions but also require some documents from you. Of course, you will have your travel passport with a Canadian visa, apparently. It should be ready when you're approaching an officer. There are other papers which may help and which you might consider taking with you before seeing the officer. Say, if you have a return flight already booked, which is always a good idea if you're traveling on a temporary visa, make sure that you have a proof with you. So remember, if you're coming to Canada with a temporary visa, with any type of temporary visa, the visit must be temporary. In other words, you are supposed to leave Canada shortly. If an officer decides that you're going to stay for good, well, put it simple, say farewell to Canada. This is why a return ticket is very, very important to have. It's not mandatory, however, if your visit is supposed to be of flexible duration. For example, if you're coming for business purpose and you do not know in advance how long it may take you to complete your assignment. But even in this case, it's wise to have a return ticket with, for example, flexible date option when you might leave Canada, right? You have to live, of course, somewhere in Canada, be it a hotel, a bed and breakfast, or host family, friends, doesn't really matter. In any case, make sure that you have a documentary proof with you, a hotel reservation prior, uh, paper from bed and breakfast, letter from a friend. Make sure that you know an address of the place where you would be staying. Proof of available funds is also an important factor in the eyes of an officer. So if a visitor cannot afford to support self in Canada for the duration of a visit, he or she will not be allowed to Canada. You may have money in your bank account or traveler's checks, or your employer or host may be paying your expenses, but in any case, be prepared to prove it. Have your traveler's checks or recent bank statement with you, an invitation letter from your host, or a reference from your employer showing that your expenses will be taken care of. And the bottom line, this is not your packing checklist. Do not tuck the papers deep into your luggage. Keep them handy and keep them available at any time. As in very do's and don'ts, here's something you must not do when coming to Canada. First, unless you have an immigrant visa in your passport, never give any reason to think that you may remain in Canada permanently. CBSA's officers' primary task is to allow genuine temporary visitors to Canada and turn back anyone, absolutely anyone, who may have an intention to remain in Canada beyond authorized period of stay. Virtually any hint that may make an officer think that you're going to move to Canada will lead to this or that sort of a trouble. You do not have to explicitly say, I'm not going to live in this wonderful country forever. No, of course not. Every officer is a professional trained to notice any inconsistency in behavior, documents in any inconsistency in communication. Say, for example, if you are coming to Canada in April with a snowboard attached to your luggage, even a trainee officer will understand that you're likely going to remain in Canada until winter. Means probably you will overstay your visa. It's not advisable to carry lots of cash with you. Though it's not prohibited, it may raise concerns about proper declaration of funds and lead to further inquiries given the strict anti-money laundering legislation adopted by Canada. Right? So if you're coming to Canada for say 5, 10 days or even 1 month, carrying with you a bag of cash with more, I don't know, like with a $50,000 would be absolutely inconsistent with your reason of travel and may lead to additional questions. So always be reasonable. And one of the worst things a visitor may ever do is to have any information about a job being offered to him or to her in Canada. If, of course, a visitor is not eligible for a proper work permit, of course. Illegal work in Canada is a very, very serious offense, and should an officer suspect that you're going to commit one, you will not be allowed to Canada, that's for sure. Just keep in mind this important thing. Do not try to hide anything in your luggage or elsewhere. CBSA will find it anyway if you're unlucky to be referred to a secondary examination. So what's a secondary examination? In a nutshell, it is the procedure of more thorough assignment of a decision regarding his or her admissibility to Canada. Normally, you won't personally experience what does it mean to pass secondary examination because genuine visitors are not taken that far. It is the sole discretion of an officer whether to refer a visitor to secondary examination or not, but there must be a reason for this. If a visitor is excessively nervous, cannot answer simple questions, or his or her answers are inconsistent, it may be sufficient for a secondary examination of such a visitor. Secondary examination takes place in a separate room where a visitor is asked more questions. His or her belongings are thoroughly searched, and based on the findings, a decision is made whether to admit this person to Canada or not. Just remember, officers have a right to retrieve or ask to provide any information from visitors' electronic devices such as laptops, tablets, cell phones. I can give you an example of a client we had about, I believe that was about 4 years ago. This is the real case, so I won't use his name here. An individual from Asia, let's call him Mr. A, comes to Canada to visit his relatives. He successfully crosses the border and does everything fine. A month later, he finds an employer in Canada, a genuine one. The employer applies for LMO, now it's called LMIA, but it was LMO those days. And in a while, when employer receives the paper for this gentleman, Mr. A, in order to change his status, has to come to the border one more time to receive work permit there. And indeed, he does come into the border. At some time during the talk with a CBSA officer, an officer asks this Mr. A to show the cell phone. What happened next was a complete nightmare. It turned out that during the last month, this Mr. A worked illegally in Canada and was stupid enough to send text messages to his co-workers where they discussed the potential projects and other work details. Of course, his visa was cancelled and he was about to be deported from Canada. When he came to us scared, and I should say, well, honestly distraught, it clearly took us more than 6 hours at the border to talk to CBSA officers, discuss the matter with them, argue, talk, present facts in defense, and over and over and over again until this Mr. was allowed to stay a little bit longer. Then he has actually changed his status to a student, and I believe it was last year he finally became permanent resident in Canada. Well, the lesson here is very, very simple. Do not do anything illegal and do not ever hide facts from CBSA. Chances are, and chances are rather high, that the truth would still be revealed. Be prepared for that. I really hope I haven't scared you today. The purpose of the webinar is not to frighten you at all. Indeed, the reason is to prepare you properly and to give you a realistic picture of what one could expect when entering Canada on any type of a temporary visa. In our previous webinars, we talked about immigration and possible programs suitable for many potential candidates. If you're looking to assess your chances and see how you may come to Canada, you actually have two major ways to do that. You may contact our trusted team in Bangladesh, Visit Center, or come to us directly. Visa Center is our local foothold, our local team who supports applicants and help us all to assist you in legal immigration ways. If you would like to speak to us directly, well, on this slide you may see our contacts, my personal contacts, in case you would like to talk, have personal questions with regards to immigration or visas to our country. Please also feel free to check our YouTube videos of previous webinars. They are all recorded and available for all of you to listen for free, of course. And in those videos, we're regularly covering different immigration, different visa programs, initiatives, and different ways how you may actually come to Canada. Please give us like, give us +1 on Google+, and share our presentations. It helps us a lot when more and more people find out how to come to Canada legally instead of using local crooks who are more interested in your money than in actual ways of immigration. Next Thursday, I would like to talk one more time about Express Entry. It's over 6 months since the program has been launched, and we can all take a pause and have a realistic outlook at major mistakes lots of applicants make and how to avoid these mistakes. Thank you all for listening today. I really appreciate you all coming. Stay tuned, and on this point, goodbye.